municipality, every state, every level of government. It's very particular. And then we're going to go through a case study that I think some of you are familiar with, and then we are going to move on to my friend Sam, who's going to talk about personal cryptography. I'm actually really, really excited to hear him talk about this, because I know it's something that he's passionate about and I'm interested in. And then we're going to open it up to some questions. So I'm going to start with a question to you all. When did FOIA pass? Any guesses?
In Virginia or?
Nationally. Federal.
1968, maybe?
That is incredibly good. So most people would guess that it was in the 90s, because during the Bill Clinton era, there was a huge expansion and an update of FOIA. And so a lot of people sort of peg it to the mid-90s. The original law was passed, had a ridiculously long name, in 1966 by Lyndon Johnson, and was put into effect in 1967. It was updated by Bill Clinton through some executive actions, and then by Congress in 1996 to make it the Electronic Freedom of Information Act, which is basically the framework that we know today. And that includes some really specific bullets that we're going to go into. What does it do? FOIA provides transparent access to the proceedings of government. And that doesn't mean that you have absolute transparency of government. What it means is that the process by which you will get information from the government is transparent and clear and laid out. It does this through three things. One, open meetings. So every meeting that a public body has to be advertised. We have to be told about it in advance, and that includes what's going to be discussed at that meeting. Right now, just down the block, City Council is meeting. They had to publish their agenda ahead of time. They had to let everybody know that this is a regular meeting and it happens at the same time every single week. If they were to change it, they would have to advertise that well in advance. And if even there was going to be a change in the agenda, they would have to publish that ahead of time. And you have to make all meetings accessible. Hopefully, before too long, we're going to start seeing changes to FOIA to update it for a more digital age, so that these meetings will now be open digitally, so that we will be ensured that meetings will promptly either be recorded and then made available, or we can watch them live online. Now, a lot of municipalities that are a little on the progressive side are already doing this, because they know that it's important to get out in front of the public. And so here in the city and in the county, almost all meetings by the boards of supervisors and some of the more important larger committees that meet in the same rooms are available online while they're happening. The other thing it does is create an open records policy. Now, again, this doesn't mean that we have access to everything that the government produces, but it means that they are going to responsibly manage these things, and they're going to disseminate the records and communications. And that's really important, that distinction between records and communications. But basically, any piece of paper or communication or digital footprint that the government makes in some way, shape, or form, except through exemptions, is going to be made available to us, either easily, it's just out there, or through some sort of request. And then access, those are the resources that we need to actually get to these records. Again, there are online portals where the government various levels of government will provide this information. And then there are occasions when we have to actually make a request for a record. And that's what we're going to drill down to in a little bit. One more quick question. To whom does FOIA apply?
Everybody.
You would hope so. Not quite.
You mean government agencies or citizens?
Think branches.
Oh, probably not the judicial one.
Right. So FOIA only applies to the executive branch, and it does this at all levels. So down to the most basic toothless committee for a municipal government, all the way up to the president. That's sort of the scope. And that means the judiciary and the legislature, they don't actually fall under FOIA. You can't FOIA judicial documents in the same way you can't FOIA legislative documents. That doesn't mean that they are off the hook. Each of them has their own public records requirements. They have to make some things available, but it just means that when you're thinking about FOIAing something, when you're thinking about, I have a question and I would like an answer, if it falls exclusively in the range of the judiciary or the legislature, you might have some challenges in trying to get a hold of that information because you won't be able to use the tools of FOIA. these are two really important FOIA resources. I will make these slides available so that people can get a hold of them. The Virginia Coalition for Open Government FOIA Guide at that URL is really, really indispensable. It just sort of lays out all of the bullets that you really need to use FOIA in Virginia. And then the FOIA Advisory Council, this is part of the Virginia FOIA law, establishes this council, and they basically are the monitoring body. So if there's a government agency that isn't complying with FOIA, they are the ones that are going to keep track of these things and make recommendations and changes. They are not, however, who you go to if you are actually having a FOIA conflict. That, unfortunately, is entirely about suing people or government bodies. And then I wanted to add this tip, and that is that you can and should always ask. The worst that anybody can say is no. So if you're not sure, if you have a question, you want an answer, and you're not really sure who the right person to ask, and somebody will probably direct you in the right direction, to the right place. One of the things that FOIA establishes is that any means by which the government can reach you is a means by which you can reach them and ask a question. That means if they have a telephone number, you can call them and ask questions. If they have an email address, you can email them and ask questions. You can even FOIA via Twitter. Now, here, unfortunately it got cut off, but I retweeted a tweet by Atul Gawande about some statistics that I was curious about at the local level. I asked Albemarle County's account, hey, is this information available? And they responded promptly. And that's actually part of FOIA. They can't just say that because Twitter's not like real or fancy, that they're not going to answer questions via Twitter. Any way that they can access you, you can access them. That brings us to a couple of other points about FOIA. You don't have to specifically say in a FOIA request, this is a FOIA request. You don't really need to do much of anything for them to have a requirement to comply by your request. So if you ask for a government record via Twitter, it is treated as a FOIA request. That means that they have a few bumpers. I call them bumpers because they're things that, just like when you're playing with the bumper cars, you're going to run into them every single time. Almost. Once you've made a request, a government agency has 5 days to provide you some type of response. That response can fall under 3 categories. 1, telling you whatever the information that you're asking for is. 2, giving you a reason why what you've asked for isn't something that they're going to be able to do. Sometimes it just falls under exemptions, like you've asked for something that is explicitly exempted, and so we're going to exempt it. And then the third is a reason for why it's going to take them longer than those 5 days, and then a time frame by which they will get it to you, and a cost. Cost is one of those things that falls under the may. So a government agency may take up to 5 days. A government agency to get you a response. The government agency at that point may take up to 7 days, they usually do, to get you the information that you asked for. And the government agency may ask you for a fee associated with generating this request. The fees are sort of an indeterminate value. They are there to prevent abuse of the system, so that bureaucrats aren't inundated with requests for things that maybe you can just look up yourself. So don't think of it as like an explicit effort of the government to keep you from information. Chances are, if you're seeing an unexpected charge, it's probably because that data is available and you just need to go get it. However, as in this case, the County of Albemarle just decided, no, we may charge a fee and we may take 5 days to get the response, but oftentimes they're just going to give you the data if it's readily available. If you send a lot of these sorts of requests, maybe you'll suddenly start seeing some fees associated. That brings us to our example. So Tom Garrett, the congressman of the Virginia 5th, at about March of this year, he had a town hall here in town. It was at UVA, and I wasn't able to attend. A lot of people did, and one of the things that they noted when they got there was a really big police presence. It was way bigger than anybody had really expected, especially when, about a month prior, fine people at Indivisible Charlottesville had held a town hall of their own that had, I believe, 1,400 people in attendance, and you didn't see a large police presence, either inside nor outside. I don't recall a police presence at all. So why in something that was being attended by just 200 people, did they have such a huge police presence? And it was sort of a question that was left standing. There were no answers from anybody about it. However, about a month later, in tiny little Monetta, Virginia, which if you have ever been there, if you, I think you're one of the few, they had another town hall at a small church in this tiny little town in between tiny little places. And once again, there was this huge police presence. A lot of people were speculating that this was an effort by Tom Garrett to intimidate people in the audience from asking questions that maybe he didn't want to answer. His staff started disseminating the idea that, well, there's a credible threat. There's a credible threat on the staff's lives, and there's a credible threat on the congressman's life. So that's the explanation for the police presence. At around July of this year, we experienced the first of what has unfortunately become several torchlight rallies that were organized by Jason Kessler. Jason Kessler had also, in March, met with Tom Garrett. And I was left to wonder, if there was a credible threat on Tom Garrett's life, why was he meeting with somebody that everybody else feels is a credible threat to our lives? And why wasn't the notion that there was a credible threat on his life made more public before these town halls so that we had a good idea of what we were walking into when we walk into a Tom Garrett town hall? So that was my question. What was the threat? And should the public know more about it? And then I was left with the question. Who should I ask if I want more information about this? You can break down the parties involved in this to Tom Garrett's office. I'm not likely to get a whole lot of information out of them. The police. The reality is that if there were actually a credible threat, the police weren't going to be forthcoming about that information, because if they are not talking about it, then either it doesn't exist or it's an active investigation and they do not comment on active investigations. So I didn't really feel like I could go to the police or to Tom Garrett with this request. So I chose the third option, and that's UVA. UVA is, and many of our public colleges, they are state agencies. There's a lot of state agencies that you interact with that maybe you don't realize you're interacting with a state agency or an agency empowered by the state that falls under FOIA. So UVA as a state agency was a resource that I could go to get more information about this event and figure out what was the threat and why we weren't informed about it. So that brings us to my, there we go. My questions that you should ask whenever you are doing a FOIA. Who, what, who, when, why, how, and what's next. So who should you ask? So I've already figured out that I need to talk to UVA to get more information about this, because that was where the event was hosted. It was actually organized and planned for by the dean of the Batten School. So I included a couple of questions here that are a little bit more general to this particular topic. Is one party more or less motivated to be forthcoming? When I ran through that list, Tom Garrett's office, the police, UVA, I had a good idea that the first two weren't going to give me any answers. So if you know that there's a particular reason why somebody's not going to probably share any answers with you, then you probably don't need to ask them. You need to look for alternatives. Most government actions are not happening in true isolation. Somebody else is involved, even if it's something as ridiculous as the Federal Register, which is literally just an office where the laws that are passed eventually, and the rules that are made, eventually get written down. Do you have an existing relationship with a specific body? Every one of us does something. We interact with the government in various levels, and sometimes we develop relationships with people. This isn't like I'm chummy with somebody in this office or that office, but somebody knows my name because maybe I go to the library a lot. Maybe I am a student at UVA. Maybe I am an independent contractor, and I'm in and out of the developer's office, of the development office all the time. So people know my name. Those are going to be really useful resources because they are experts at what they do. So even if they're not the ones that are going to give you the answers, they're probably a good resource for where you want to start. Somebody that you already have a relationship with that knows who you are and is willing to talk to you, and who's most likely to have what you're looking for. That you're often, if you don't know who it is, often somebody that is an expert is going to tell you. In this case, I want to talk to UVA. And I want to find out more about what the security arrangements were for this event so that I can find out what the credible threat was. And that brings us to what? What are you looking for? There are two kinds of government documents that are covered under FOIA. Documents, records, true to public records. Often those are actually really easy to find. We're talking about the minutes of a meeting, the roster of attendees at some sort of training, or just records or something that is generated whenever we do something where we interact with the government, including property records and those sorts of things. And then there's communication. Communication used to basically mean, pre-electronic FOIA, memos. If you are a official in the government and you wanted to let everybody else know that this is how we were going to start doing something, you would do it in a memo. That would be distributed to all the people that needed to be involved, and then it would be recorded. Somewhere there was a record that the memo was distributed. Sometimes the reason that you wrote a memo was just because you wanted something recorded. Maybe you don't need anybody else to know about it, but you want it in the record official, and so you would write a memo. This is actually one of the practices that the FBI does, and why after every FBI meeting, the two officers that were involved in an interview, the two agents that were involved in an interview, sit down and they write an account of what they did and what happened when they did it. Not because they are always engaged in some sort of police action, but because whatever they're doing, they want it recorded, just in case. So today we don't write memos. What do we write? Emails. We write emails all the time. Some of them are useless, some of them are really important. Some of them are truly official emails that we're sending to let people know. Some of them we're just sending because we want somebody else to know that something happened or something didn't happen. And this is where this has become incredibly valuable. More recently, text messaging, chat apps, those sorts of things that have lived on our personal devices more than they've necessarily lived in official channels, they're being called in. And as the Heafy report sort of points out, they're really important. And it's going to become increasingly important in the future for us to find a way to capture these records of communication that are official in that they are acting in the official duties of the government, but that are happening in these spaces that are outside of the control of the government, outside of the control of the office for which you work. So there are times when you've probably seen a FOIA from a police officer where what comes out are screen caps that are then printed and Xeroxed and scanned of text messages. And that is how they're handling that. Hopefully in the future, more electronic mobile communications are going to be better handled so that we have a better way to capture them and distribute them. But that's what we got for right now. In this case, I wanted emails. I wanted the emails that happened where people were discussing the threat that required the police presence at this town hall in March. A couple other questions I put in there. Is there a direct way to find it without initiating a request? This is what I was talking about earlier about, if it's a record, then maybe you can just go to the website of the agency that you're talking about, and maybe there's a record there that you can find it. It's not unheard of for municipal websites for particular agencies are really bad. And it's really hard to find the records. And so it's not inappropriate if you can't find a record on the website to just go ahead and ask for it. And is this just the start of a search, or is this the whole search? The reason I included that is, like I said, everything that sort of happens in the government, it gets recorded somewhere. So if something happens at a training meeting, if you just want to know, to get a better idea of who you need to be talking to, who was in a meeting, that's recorded somewhere. So being able to just know that maybe you're just looking for a list of names before you start trying to find out who you can get the most information from, that's useful, and it sort of determines where you go from here. Obviously, you can always start over. If you've made a request, you don't quite have your answer, you want to try again. Now we have the second who. This is for when you're looking for communication. You really want to know whose communication you're looking for. You want to know how big of a net you want to cast. How many do you literally want all of the emails ever sent within this agency and every employee of this agency on a topic? Probably not, especially because they will come back to you with a very high fee associated with that. Maybe you just want officials that are at the top. Maybe you want some of their subordinates. You have to be able to figure out some of the names. That's where, like I said, sometimes the first thing that you're doing is just figuring out who is involved so that you can start collecting these names. Are there exempt parties, and does that matter? The exemptions fall under the may. A government agency may exempt certain information. That doesn't mean that they always will. So one of the sort of quirks in the FOIA, in Virginia FOIA, is that presidents of the university can exempt their communications. They can exempt a lot of their records and their communications just as a matter of course. But that doesn't mean that they will. So Teresa Sullivan was on my list of people that I wanted emails from. Are there any exempt parties? Does that matter? Who's most likely to have what you're looking for? There it is again. Who is most likely to have what you're looking for? So sometimes to make sure that you catch what you want, you do actually want to cast a wider net than just the absolute top of the chain. In this case, I requested the emails regarding the security for this event from the president, the chief of university police, and the chief of security, which is a separate division within the university, as well as the dean of the school, one of the actual hosts that was actually in attendance of the event, and and their communications office, because most of the time the communications office ends up being a catch-all for you need to know about this just in case. So that was how I cast that one. The next question is when? When should your search begin and end? Again, how big of a net do you want? Do you want across all of time, or do you want just surrounding one specific period of time? And how do you define that period? For me, I drew the period around when Tom had announced this town hall and the day after the town hall happened. And I wanted the day after because I wanted to be able to catch any comments about how it went. We all know how it went. Jason Kessler showed up with his shields and his goons, and there were some tussles with some of the counter-protesters that were there. Everything ended up being okay. There wasn't a big fight. There wasn't a big brawl. Jason Kessler was kept isolated. The counter-protesters were kept safe. And then the town hall went off. Nothing particularly interesting happened inside to require all of those police. But I wanted to know if there were going to be any celebrations. Oh, hurrah, we caught the guys before they got in there. Something along those lines. You don't want to get too narrow. I could have said, I want just the emails the day of the event and the day after the event. But I probably would have missed a lot of useful information. In fact, I would have. You also want to make sure that you're not limiting yourself in the scope of your question. When might you catch the most hits? And then when might those hits be the most important? For me, in this particular question, I had a really easy timeline. But say you're just looking generally at communications regarding a specific topic, and you're not really looking for communications about a specific event. But you can still look at a timeline of events surrounding that topic, and you can pick a few spots. Maybe you don't FOIA the entire record of time, but maybe you say, this newspaper post was published at this time. And so I know that reporters reached out to them before that, and I know that they would have communicated about it after. So maybe a week before and a week after is the right time frame to try to catch information about something that happened that maybe wasn't a big event, but was still something notable within the topic that you're looking for. And then why? It's really important to distinguish for when you actually have a question that you need an answer for, and when you're trying to prove a supposition. I suppose that Tom Garrett is a bad congressman. That he's probably not the kind of guy that is always going to be honest when he's trying to make himself look good. But that's a supposition. Suppositions are really dangerous because they're really hard to prove. I would need an email where he says that he's a liar, where he says that he's being disingenuous when he posits these policy ideas, or when he says that there's a specific threat against him. I'm not going to find that, especially because I need him to do it in some sort of public record. So you really want to make sure that you're asking a question and that it has an answer, and that needs to be a clear and definite answer, or you're going to have to set yourself. You should look for experts. There's lots of different experts and lots of different things, and you don't need to be at the top of a ladder to be an expert. Allison Rabel of the Daily Progress had a pretty big scoop from the August 12th event, because when she went and filed her FOIA request, she asked for a specific document, ICS 200 series documents that were submitted in preparation for the August 12th event. She didn't know that before August 12th. And she didn't know that the day after August 12th. She knew that when she consulted an expert in emergency management, and they told her that these documents exist, and these documents are submitted whenever there's a pre-planned event with the police, with fire, with rescue, that they're designed for any event where you're going to have multiple agencies coming together and doing something in coordination. So, having discovered that this is what she needed, that made it a lot more likely that she was going to get a good hit than if she just sent them a request for planning documents. And that sort of falls in the May. You might get a hit on something if you use a vague term. But if that's not something that is already required to be distributed, they probably are going to be kind of anal about it. They're going to want you to be as specific as possible, because if you sue them on, well, I asked for a planning document, then they can get away with saying, well, it wasn't a specific enough request. There were lots of planning documents. We don't know what she was looking for. So she asked for ICS 200 series events. Find your experts. Sometimes you might be the expert. You might not realize it. Other times, again, it can be as simple as going ahead and calling the agency and saying, I don't know what I'm looking for. Can you help me figure it out? In this case, she could have called the communications office and said, what documents are usually filled out for something like this? You can find a corollary event and say, what documents get submitted for every year for, say, Foxfield, an event that gets held every year, and for which ICS 200 documents are always filled out. So that's figuring out why you're asking the question. It'll help you with the next step, which is actually phrasing the question, the how. Do you have the right term to guarantee success? ICS 200's forms, that was the right term. For what I was looking for, I could actually keep it reasonably vague. Security concerns regarding this event. So they were limiting it to emails discussing the town hall, and then emails where security was discussed. That makes it reasonably limited. It makes it highly likely that this is going to be something that yields hits, and yields hits that aren't going to be just the same forward that got sent to 150 people 150 times, but rather actual discussions between people. The next question is, can you afford to be wrong? If they come to you and they say, it's going to cost $180 for us to generate this, which was the fee for the UVA one, which I think some of you contributed to the GoFundMe to make that happen, so thank you. So if they do that, then you need to ask yourself, is this something that I can afford to do once and never again because it's expensive? Or maybe this is something that you're working with a group of people and you guys can pool together some cash, you guys have funders that might be able to help you out, and you can get this wrong the first time. And maybe you won't have the answer that you're looking for, but maybe you'll be able to look at it again and try the question out again. If you get a null hit, that means you ask a question and there aren't any records that apply. Or they're just, maybe they're being specific, they're being too specific. You can keep asking the question. You can ask the question a dozen times. And if a dozen times it's still 0, then great. Like, you didn't waste any money. But if they come back to you and they say, okay, now it's gonna cost you $150, you at least know that now you've got hits. Whatever the question that you're asking, however you're phrasing it, now it's generating a different result. So when it's free, ask over and over and over again until you think you found it. Again, talk to your experts. But once it starts having hits, make sure that you haven't widened it out too far and made yourself more likely to just get a lot of useless hits, and then end up paying a bunch of money for emails about somebody's something that weren't actually related to what you were looking for. And then, can the body that you're approaching help you refine your terms? Again, this is, if you've got a relationship, if you can ask the questions that lead to the answers that you really, really need to refine your question, then that's worth doing. So asking, if you don't know what document you're looking for, what type of communication you're looking for, asking is like what normally happens during this type of event, and maybe that will help you refine what you need to do. What's next? So my request to UVA was communications for security related to this town hall from, I think, March 3rd, which is when he announced the town hall, to the day after the town hall. I ended up getting, and this is what you'll usually get, a huge chunk of PDFs of emails that aren't OCR'd, they're not searchable, they're not particularly useful. You kind of have to flip through them and read them yourself. And it was a lot. So I had to process, like, okay, what do I have here? And what I was able to do is create a timeline. And the timeline gave me some of my answers, and it raised other questions. Sometimes you're not going to be the right person to look through the document. Maybe it's a dense budget document. Maybe it's a dense listing of minutes. Maybe it's just a lot of emails, and you're going to need a lot of help trying to figure out what you've got. Look for help. Again, go to your experts. Go find somebody that is really good at whatever it is that you've landed on, and have them help you. That is where I'm going to plug. Do we have any press? The Virginia Press Association has put out the Freedom of Information Act in Virginia Reporters Guide. You can call them. The number is right here on the back. I've got one spare for a lucky attendee. They will send this to you for $4, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, and might be worth it in the long run. And inside the front cover, one of the most valuable things is a list of FOIA hotline numbers. These are all reporters that are in Virginia whose specialty is FOIA matters. And if you're going to be a FOIA wonk, you're also going to be the kind of person that is used to reading dense, boring government papers. And so these people are going to be really good at helping you suss out whether you have something valuable and maybe you don't. And they're also going to be really useful for all of those earlier questions of trying to figure out, like, do you have a question that is going to be well answered? And then do you have an answer, or do you have more questions? I had more questions. I had an answer, but I had more questions. And I wasn't going to be able to put those questions to particularly useful function. I am not an opponent of Tom Garrett's, and given that he's not willing to go talk to any of his constituents, I wasn't going to be able to get in front of him and ask him my questions. So I did the next best thing, which was that I reached out to contacts in the press to just say, this is what I have. And then I made it publicly available. I made sure that everybody had access. I gave lead time to a couple of reporters just so that they would know that this is what I'm doing. I reached out to people like Ken and some people with Surge to find out what they knew about what Tom had, the questions that Tom had raised. And again, I came up with more questions than I came up with answers, but at least I had a good idea that the people that I knew were involved in the town hall, they weren't the threat. And as far as UVA was concerned, the only serious security threat that they looked at was none other than Jason Kessler. So what are you going to do with what you have? Maybe if you can get in front of somebody, you can ask them the questions directly. Maybe you can send emails, you can tell your friends, you can tell other activists, but you can also talk to the press. The press is not your enemy, and maybe they're not going to do anything with it either, but at least being able to let people know what you know is distributing the information that previously wasn't available. You can always ask, but you have to be prepared to be disappointed. In the long run, I was disappointed because I didn't find the smoking gun of, ha, Tom Garrett is a liar, now we know. Instead, what I had was, Tom Garrett had security concerns. UVA, they didn't really, but they responded.